Hello and welcome to today's webinar on Your Data is a Mess. Take control of your data quality issues. I'm Megan Winnery, Senior Demand Gen Manager at Telium, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be approximately 60 minutes and will be recorded, and the slides of the recording and the presentation will be made available at the end of the session. You'll also find some related resources in the attachments and links section that you can view during or after the webinar. And we want to hear your questions, so please use the Q&A feature to submit them. And for any that we aren't able to answer live, we'll follow up with you after. And we'll also be live tweeting with the social hashtag Telium Data Quality Webinar, so we encourage you to retweet, like, and share as we live tweet throughout the webinar. All right, and now on to today's presenters. Adam Corey leads Telium's marketing efforts and is responsible for driving awareness and education of tag management and customer data management. He has over 13 years experience in digital analytics, marketing, and business development. Prior to joining Telium, Adam led the solutions consulting groups at Upsite and Crowd Factory, now part of Marketo. He also previously led technical production efforts at abcnews.com. Adam works closely with the Blast and Telium partnership alongside Joe Christopher. Joe Christopher is the VP Analytics at Blast Analytics and Marketing, leading a large team of strategists, technologists, and analysts. Joe is a DAA certified web analyst and a certified expert in Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics. He consults with clients to integrate analytics into their business and drive actionable insights, and regularly shares his passion and knowledge of analytics through corporate trainings, blogging, and speaking engagements. Glad to have you both with us today, and let's go ahead and get started. Adam?
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. Thanks to everybody who joined us today on the webcast, and thank you to Joe Christopher. I'm honored to have you join. I have been a part of many sessions that you've led and roundtable discussions, and this is a topic that I care quite a bit about, and I know you're passionate about as well, so we're excited to dive in. So today, as Megan mentioned, we're going to talk about data quality. And I think we all know the saying, we've probably thrown it around a lot in meetings, garbage in means garbage out. But what I find really interesting is that we've been doing digital analytics for a couple of decades, many of us for many years, or maybe all the way since the beginning. And this is a problem that we've been talking about since the beginning. And I think the reason this is still a challenge is not only do we have fundamental challenges that are just inherent with data collection and analysis, but we're also every day getting more and more data from more devices, more interactions, more vendors and channels. All of these generate more data that need to be analyzed. And it's hard to keep up and build the best practice approach across the entire data supply chain unless you really think through and get partners throughout the organization. And that's what a lot of today's webcast is going to be about. So first off, we're going to talk more about what data quality is and why it's critical to your organization's success, some things that you can spot in terms of the early warning signs of poor data quality. We'll talk about some of the common challenges that pop up, and what I think will be really interesting is Joe and I will take both an organizational as well as a technological approach to solving these. And then we'll talk through some best practices. We were originally going to call this a fireside chat, but unfortunately neither of us are anywhere near a fire, so we're just going to call it a chat. We're going to go through some best practices to ensure clean and quality data and really how to take back control of the data challenge. So first off, I think it makes sense for us to define what we mean by data quality. So data quality, there's a lot of ways that you can look at this, but let's simplify this as much as possible. It really means that we need to have a level of reliability in our data to be able to make good decisions. Is our data complete? Are our tracking systems implemented correctly, reporting correctly? Is the right data being passed through? It also means that we're collecting the right information. There's obviously a ton of information that we can collect, and a lot is possible, but are we collecting the right data to make decisions for our business? That last point also has a really important implication for privacy. Am I collecting just the right amount of data to understand an individual without compromising trust and privacy? And I think this stat is really interesting. You know, on average, global companies feel that 26% of their data is inaccurate, and that number keeps rising. So I think as we look at our own data inside of our organizations and we think about what our uncertainties are or what our blind spots are in our data or where we're just not as confident, that means that the analysis and the data that we're sharing inside of our organization to chart the future of our organizations is also not as reliable. And that's really what today's webinar is all about. So with that, this is an interactive webinar, so we want to start off and learn a little bit more from you guys. So let's start off with our first poll question. And that should be popping up on the screen here any moment. But our first poll question, we want to know a little bit more about you and do you have data quality issues? And let's see, not sure if that poll is coming up yet. There we go. All right, so Joe, I think this is an interesting thing to look at. We've got votes coming in from the audience right now around, do they have data quality issues? The options are, yes, my organization does have quality issues, but it doesn't affect me. Yes, it affects my day-to-day operations. Yes, and it affects my organization. It affects my organization negatively. And what's data quality? So, you know, a little bit of a trick question here is that we didn't really give a no out there, but I think it's interesting to look at some of the results coming in, and the majority of people are saying, yep, it affects my day-to-day. Joe, does this jive with what you typically see in the organizations that you work with?
Absolutely, Adam. Yeah, I mean, really, you know, the organizations that I get to work with, they all have data quality issues, right? It's no secret that this impacts everyone. And so really what we hope to provide today to the audience of this webinar is, you know, some tips on how to improve the situation. You know, data quality issues are going to happen. So let's talk about how to minimize those.
Well, I think with that, let's pause the voting there, and Joe, why don't you kick us off and let's talk a little bit more about why data quality is such a challenge for organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, data quality is serious. It's part of the DNA of any data-driven organization. It's part of the data governance program in your organization. So, in most platforms like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, once the data has been collected and processed, you can't go back and reprocess that data to fix a data integrity issue. You're often stuck with either fancy calculated metrics, annotations of notes to warn users about certain date ranges when they pull reports, and hopefully they see that. Or you're left with like segments to manipulate the data during specific time periods where there are data quality issues. When you don't have quality data, you can't be data-driven. You can't identify opportunities or learn about which of your efforts are successful. Ultimately, this can impact your bottom line. So according to Market Week, poor data quality can cost brands up to 6% of their annual revenue. That's pretty serious. No one wants to cause data quality issues. It's accidental, but sometimes this is caused by carelessness, lack of following processes, or just a pure accident. So if leaders in your organization repeatedly hear about data quality issues, their first inclination is going to be to point to the people that are causing it. While that's sometimes appropriate, really what we're talking about today, what we're going to dive into is about the processes behind this. You know, trust is a critical piece of this. With data quality issues, and repeated data quality issues destroy trust. So to be clear, data quality is not just about missing data that you can't take action on or inaccurate data collection, but it's also about even about personally identifiable information, PII. So while you should always eliminate the possibility of capturing PII, if you are caught and exposed by the public of doing so, there are many repercussions that can take place. So Google Analytics, as an example, they strictly prohibit PII data collection. It's in their terms of service. whether you're using the free version or the 360 paid version. And they'll delete the entire date range of your data that contains PII if you even accidentally collect PII. If this ends up in the public view, that you're exposing personally identifiable information and sending it to other marketing tags, let's say that ends up in the news. Your customers are going to start to wonder if they can trust your organization with their data. Remember, if your website is exposing PII in the query string parameter, for example, it's sending this PII, this personally identifiable information, to every marketing analytics tag on your site. And exposing this data is just extremely careless, and unfortunately, I see this often in the audits that I execute. Ultimately, external trust of your brand is critical. In fact, 30% of consumers are happy to share their data if they trust the company that they're interacting with. If there are repeated data quality issues, sometimes people within the organization start to have a negative image of the analytics tool itself. So negative, in fact, that sometimes the only way to restore trust is to move to a different analytics tool completely. It's often unnecessary, but the perception is so strong and pervasive in the organization that this can sometimes be the only solution to reinvigorate the analytics program. You may get to the point that you simply have to start over and your investment in your analytics program becomes worthless.
All right, so with that, let's find out a little bit more from the audience in our next poll. So the question is, which of these data quality issues impacts your business the most? Is it gaps in tracking, raw and data-driven decisions, costly tools, or the cost of time and effort to correct data quality issues? So Joe, I think when you mentioned in an earlier slide the fact of PII information popping up in the URL, so that's something that I actually never thought of that might have such an impact there in terms of maybe one implementation choice that then exposes PII kind of throughout. So even implementation challenges have quite a bit of impact when it comes to what this means in terms of either trust but also the downstream data quality.
Yeah, often there's these unintended consequences, right? When you have a web developer that, for instance, is just looking to build the application or build the website and get it functional, they sometimes are not thinking about, what about data collection? So it's really about having a connected team, breaking down silos so that everyone's on the same page with the importance of how data is structured on the website or in the app and how that's being collected.
So I think it's interesting that really hits on the top vote right now, which is, to me, the cost of time and the effort to correct data quality issues. Someone made a mistake or did something, or there's an implementation decision that was made that's impacting, but unfortunately everyone is wearing several different hats and they're not dedicating enough time to correct those. Do you see that as a pretty common challenge inside of the organizations that you consult with?
Yeah, I would say that that's the most common challenge. Absolutely.
All right, so we'll pause the voting there, and why don't we dive in a little bit more and let's talk about some of the indicators of poor data quality. Joe, I think this is a frightening chart right here. What's going on?
Thanks, Adam. So if you've seen a line chart like the one on the right, you know about data quality issues. So this is just a simple chart that's looking at data by month, and I think it's April that it flatlines. So when you see that flat line down to 0, something happened here. In this specific case, I believe it was an issue with the tag that was removed from a page. I mean, there's so many issues that cause data quality issues. So perhaps the code broke on that page temporarily or something else. So you may find your organization repeatedly using bad data to make decisions, and it's never ending up in a positive direction. Sometimes the data quality issue can be so hidden from plain sight that people are just perplexed. Data leakage is the unintentional act of exposing sensitive data to third parties. This might be PII or even data that's proprietary to your business, to your organization. It can be consumed by hackers, competitors, or malicious tags. that may exist on the site. These are serious issues.
Hey, Joe, before you go on, I'd love to define PII for some of the audience members. I think it might be helpful just if you could explain a little bit more about what that is.
Sure. Yeah, so PII stands for Personally Identifiable Information. And really, this level of data can be tied directly back to an individual, to a person. Examples of PII can be things like email address, even username, because people use their real names and usernames. This could be, in the expanded EU definition of PII, this could be IP address. This could be even postal code in certain situations. As an example, in the UK, some postal codes are tied directly to an individual household. So those are some examples of PII. And some of the ways that we get around PII, instead of collecting, a username, we may want to collect more of a pseudo-anonymous identifier, like a numeric identifier that represents the user instead of their email address.
Great, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's dive into some more examples here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. So what are some common issues? So as a consultant to many companies, my team and I are direct witnesses of all sorts of issues. We get to be the heroes in the situation and solve issues, which is awesome. We get to help develop processes to prevent issues from happening again and provide quality data to executives. There are many examples of data quality issues that are unintentionally created by developers, both in-house and consultants. I spoke about this a few slides ago. For example, one of my clients had a large concentration of Internet Explorer visitors when they were using, the, to get a little bit technical, they were using a .includes method in their code. And IE doesn't support that, but it does in Edge. So we ended up having a large issue for some of those early IE users, even all the way up to IE 11. That's just one example. Another one of my clients had an issue where they were using HTML selectors to listen for clicks on a page and then to track it. The web developer had no idea that when they changed the structure of the page to improve it for user experience, that it broke the tracking. So it was something the organization was doing in a positive way to improve the user experience, but no one remembered that, hey, we're actually tracking these elements. And that happens, unfortunately, all the time. Another common issue is that there's code dependencies, such as, let's say, the jQuery library is removed, or even the order of the code on the page is changed. All of these seemingly small changes can cause data quality issues. Recently, a client of mine had an issue where there was a JavaScript code added to tag management that was overriding a global object that the website logic was depending on. And in addition to preventing data collection, it actually broke the functionality of the site and caused a major issue. So these types of issues, they occur, they're serious. And so, as we talk further in the webinar today, we'll talk about strategies to combat this. So, I have firsthand knowledge of a lot of the common data quality issues that occur, and so, unfortunately, it's not common for my team to come in and start helping an organization to understand their data, only to find that metrics stopped incrementing 6 months ago, or to find that the data has never been accurate and they've been attempting to make decisions on this data. Other examples of PII data collection or not correctly filtering out internal data. We know that we use our own variables much differently than real visitors. So when we're talking about filtering out internal data, this can cause significant issues depending on the amount of traffic if you aren't filtering out that data, or for instance, maybe you're using site monitoring tools that are impacting the quality of your data. So it's not just about missing data, it's about the quality of the data. And this has all kinds of impacts on a business. There's the internal impact of not being able to make data-driven business decisions. There's the external impact where exposure or data leakage of this data can erode the trust that your customers have in your brand. So why? The biggest thing is that there's often no attention to data quality until a large issue occurs. It's not a problem until it's a problem. A large enough issue that gains the attention of leadership in an organization to the point where that leadership finally asks the question, how can we prevent this going forward? I urge you not to let it get to that point. Instead, let's come up with a plan today. This is a process, people, technology problem. The combined approach is what is going to put you in a better situation. It's no joke that proper QA to prevent data quality issues is time consuming. It takes more time up front than just pushing code changes live that risk the integrity of your data. So sometimes you have to slow down and execute proper QA against your data. Often I find that there's a lack of controls and established processes around who gets to push tag management changes live as an example. And this can lead to unintended consequences, of course. So the perfect combo, a blended approach, so let's talk about that. What we find works best to correct data quality issues is a blended approach of both organizational adjustments and the technology that can drive positive improvements. On the organizational approach, progress really starts at executive buy-in. Without this buy-in, your efforts will lack the support required to make this an organization focus and investment. Once you have the buy-in, procedures can be put in place and enforced. An organization's silos can be a virus to data quality progress. You must break down these silos so that teams can really speak with each other so that they can learn from each other and become better together. The organization must also work to identify the early indicators that there is a problem. A process must be put into place to get here. This then brings us to the technological considerations. Adam, can you talk about the technological approach?
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back in a few to the executive buy-in angle that you just brought up. I think that's an interesting one that can sometimes be hard to impart the challenges that may seem very down in the weeds, but have larger organizational impacts. But yeah, from a technology standpoint, speaking as a technology vendor here, I think it's important to pause and think about the fact that in a lot of ways tech created this challenge. And so partnering with your technology vendors, your tech teams can help to solve this. And I think going back to that flatlining chart, which stopped my heart as well. So that chart could be also charting what happens to our heart rates when we see something like that. But that could be many things, as you mentioned. It could be someone made a code change. There could be some sort of a conflict in the implementation. Someone could have made an intentional change in your tag manager. It could be a vendor issue, maybe a data collection issue. It could even be a business issue. Maybe your marketing program stopped working. There's so many things that are going on and so many stakeholders that are involved that I think working with your vendors as well as across your different teams inside of the organization are really key to it. From a technology standpoint, there's a lot of things that Tealium has really focused on as a vendor because of our perspective, how we see things and how we can look to avoid challenges in the future. And that's starting with even the most straightforward start of the journey of data is building and defining a data layer. And a data layer is a way to describe the data that you're capturing on a page. And I think one of the things that's interesting about a data layer is there are a couple sides to it. There's the implementation side of what I'm going to call different data points in my web implementation or my mobile implementation or somewhere else, but it also is the process by which you create that data layer inside of your organization. Because inside of that, you're going to ask questions around what data is important to collect, how are we going to collect it, how are we going to populate this data. That sets you up really nicely throughout your entire, what we call a data supply chain, the journey of what happens to that data after it's collected. This allows you to standardize collecting data not only from one source, but all of those sources. At the same time, I think data quality and how we use technology at different parts of the data supply chain can be a good way to start a conversation inside of the organization because it allows you to have some commonality across the org and across different departmental silos because you're all contributing to data and benefiting from data. So thinking about what are the early indicators of data quality issues that we've been talking about, and using the technology that a lot of us live in all day long, whether it's an analytics solution or a marketing automation solution, using the data that feeds those technologies is really the way that we can have conversations inside of our organizations. I also think it's important to remember that we don't do this alone. We have to partner together with not only internal but external teams. So thinking about what I like to call the trifecta of the partnerships is when an agency or consultant such as you, Joe, your technology vendor, and your internal teams are working together to make sure that there's transparency and openness and documentation around the process. Those types of relationships will actually help solve a lot of the challenges that can sometimes pop up. One of the things that I hit on is talking to your vendor and talking about where a vendor can help to solve this. If technology creates this problem, well, in some ways technology can help solve this. And this is a great example inside of our product of something that was developed out of user feedback that I love, and this saves me a lot of heartache and flatlining of my own emotions when it comes to looking at data. And it's around taking that data layer and building a specification out of what data is in that, so I know that data is being captured correctly, it's in there, the required elements are being populated. And so this is just a quick look inside of building an event specification based on an e-commerce event such as a cart ad. What are the data points that we always expect to see when a cart ad happens, when someone adds a product to a cart? These types of definitions and documentation throughout the journey can help make that ongoing QA process and quality assurance process really make sure that it works well for everyone. And thinking about how, from a tech standpoint, technology can help solve this in line, what's the next thing after I decide what data I want to collect? Well, often I give that to a developer. In this case, I can grab the code, but I can also download an implementation guide based on the decisions that I just made, what data points are required or not required, and give that to my developer so he or she knows exactly what's expected to be implemented, what we want to call it, how it's going to be used. And then this is really the key thing that comes in next, which is then to, on an ongoing basis, inspect the data that comes into our website or into a mobile application and matches these events. So every time I see a cart ad event that happens, are the events that are happening, the data that's happening underneath that, are they actually matching the specification that we decided at the outset was important to our business? This is, again, our approach from a technology standpoint to solve this problem. But if you think back to when you've done an implementation of a technology before, unfortunately, because we're all wearing so many hats and we're doing so many things, we often focus so much on the implementation at the outset, and then we don't, on an ongoing basis, come back and make sure, hey, does the data we're collecting now match the specification that we decided was important to our business? Yes or no? And a lot of times what we find is that people make incremental adjustments along the way, but don't necessarily update documentation, processes, the things that need to happen to make sure that we're always making sure that we've made decisions, that we're sticking to those decisions that we've made. So with that, Joe, again, I apologize that we're not by a fireside somewhere enjoying a nice cocktail as we have a nice fireside chat. But let's talk about some of these ways that we can take back some of the control here. So first up, I want to hit on something that's come up a number of times today in our chat, which is around getting buy-in from the different teams to focus on data quality. I think it's it's hard to get executives excited about this. It's hard to get all parts of the organization to get excited about data quality. So Joe, how does the company go about getting buy-in? What are the steps that they need to focus on? How do they make this data quality topic something that executives care about and can even get them focused and excited about diving in and solving?
Sure, Adam. So when I look at gaining buy-in across the organization, one of the things is that it really starts with tearing down barriers and demonstrating the value of data quality. You should start with building an internal campaign to educate executives on the risks of bad data. There's a great resource that ObservePoint built that we linked to in the resource section, and it speaks about what is poor data quality costing your organization. So it's a great resource, and I urge you guys to check it out. Sometimes there are other governance practices that may already exist in your organization. So try to piggyback onto those and show the existing business value and commitment, and that there's an opportunity to integrate with existing processes to accelerate execution and create organizational-wide alignment. Another tip would be to look for case studies that might speak to your objectives. There are many competitor or industry case studies that you might be able to leverage to bring attention to the executives in your organization. Another tip would be try not to overwhelm people. Data governance, which is really what we're talking about here, it sounds like a scary word, but it's not. It's start with just casual one-on-one conversations, have those over lunch, create authentic personal connections, and then identify ways that you can connect over a shared objective. For example, you may identify someone that can't get data today because it can't be trusted or they just have no access to it. And you can talk to them about how this can be resolved, and then how the right processes and governance could be put into place to help resolve that situation. So those are some of the quick thoughts I have on buy-in across the organization, but I know we'll get a little deeper into some other topics that relate back to this too.
Yeah, I think when we think about going across the organization, we have to go up inside of the organization. So getting executive sponsors to really help break down some of the silos that we have where people aren't necessarily used to working with one another. And I think the point of really hitting on the cost and the risks of bad data being collected are really key here. If from the data that you just mentioned, using that as a way to say what is data quality, or poor data quality rather, actually costing businesses like us, and then connecting that to maybe other challenges that you've seen historically inside of the organization. Those types of things can really start to resonate with leaders in the organization that can help sponsor getting some kind of cross-departmental buy-in actually happening. So great points there. So you've gotten the buy-in. That would be a huge win. That's great. Now I think you need to build your view of your data and your data supply chain and your data governance programs to match that. So, Joe, what do I do once I've gotten that buy-in? What are the things that I need to focus on? From my standpoint, one of the first things that I would think about would be really bringing and building out a framework of what data we have, taking a data inventory, identifying who in the organization is actually a part of contributing to or benefiting from data. But Joe, yeah, what do you do when you get the buy-in and you want to take the next steps to actually follow through and make this something that's meaningful to improving data quality and improving your organization?
So Adam, I completely agree about your point with the building out the framework with the data inventory. That's a critical step here. There's a number of actionable steps that you can take once you have the buy-in. So remember that you need to understand why data quality is important and explain that to each person participating so that your quest for better data quality can be successful. First, you should start with developing a RACI matrix. So for those that might not be familiar with that term, that it basically helps to determine or assign who is going to be responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, as the process improvement around data quality is built, executed, and maintained. So without clear ownership roles, I find that things have a way of just not getting done. Next, establish a baseline. I recommend going through an exercise to understand your organization's level of analytics maturity. This type of assessment can be used to show where you were and then to track the evolution of the organization as you approach better data quality and other analytics initiatives. Then I recommend an audit to your point of building out the data inventory. So what data sources exist? What are the known issues that need to be resolved? It's critical that we all agree on the data nomenclature, the data definitions. When I use the word bounce rate within an organization, do people really understand what that means? We can't assess data quality until we have these clear data definitions. Once we then understand our issues, the next step is to develop a plan to correct the current situation. Most importantly, a QA process has to be developed to ensure that attention is placed on the data collection quality. Quality QA takes more time up front, as I mentioned earlier, but really it's insurance against future issues. I recommend, what I find works well is establishing a recurring quarterly data quality reviews. I think that's a fantastic way to approach this on a recurring basis.
You know, Joe, I think your concept of not everyone necessarily agrees or has the same nomenclature when it comes to what a bounce rate is, because that's going to mean something different to people who look at data differently or working in different channels. I think that's such an interesting point. We had built something a long time ago inside of our tag management product that allowed people to kind of lock down definitions of values. So for example, conversion rate. So that way there was one approved definition of what it means to, or rather order value, not conversion rate, where I could lock down a definition of something inside of the organization and no one could change it except one team or one particular person. And that way everyone always had to go back to that same one value if they wanted to use it to fuel any of their conversion reporting. But I think that's such an interesting point that even though it can seem like everyone inside the org should understand a bounce rate or order total or something like that, there's different nuances that can really change the way someone looks at it and could end up having huge repercussions down the line. The next one that we're going to get into is one that really popped up as we were talking about going up the food chain and getting executives to care about data quality. I gotta say, there's no better time than today to get leaders excited about driving data quality change inside of their organization. If you've been anywhere close to a computer in the last 2 years, you've been reading about GDPR coming online last month. You've been seeing all the news articles about either privacy issues, data breaches. Almost every day there's something that's terrifying. And for the C-suite inside organizations, this is something that should be freaking them out every day. And you can be the hero inside of your organization to say, hey, not only is it okay to be scared about this stuff, but if we focus on some of the steps to govern the data that we're collecting, taking a look at where does sensitive information or really all of our information go to other technologies, taking control of that, it's a great opportunity to get, in my mind, everyone to participate. One of the things that I loved about GDPR, and yes, I just said I love GDPR as a marketer, which is weird, but I do because good data is important to marketing because it allows us to understand our customers, our prospects. It allows us to build better experiences. But it brings the legal and the compliance teams to the table. It brings the tech team to the table. It brings the analysts to the table where we can all talk and we have the exact same goal. There are very few times in my entire career that I've had the same priorities as legal, compliance, tech, analysts, and that's what makes this so cool is because everyone has a shared interest in improving data quality and understanding and building transparency inside the organization. Joe, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on leveraging kind of the current topic to help enforce better data governance standards?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's it's sad but true that the threat of, in the case of GDPR, of a monetary impact to the business, and more importantly, hopefully the perception of trust that your customers have in your organization, that often can be the fuel needed to get executive buy-in and to establish a necessary data governance program that can address data quality issues. So, Adam, you mentioned that you love GDPR, and really, I see that GDPR has started to open the eyes of organizations and to really take data governance seriously. So I think that's a win for the industry from that perspective.
I agree. Gotta love GDPR. You actually have to love it, otherwise it's going to be very costly. So speaking of that, this idea of, and I'm not necessarily talking about the globe or international, but, thinking globally in your organization about all the different organizational teams and tools and business units that are working with data. I think designing an organizationally wide data quality goals and governance that meet the needs of both the organization as well as the individual scope of people that are managing analytics or email data or personalization. I think you need to balance both sides of this. You need to think about, what's the full scope of data quality and value inside of the organization, but you need to think and be able to act locally or for the email marketing manager to make sure that they're both contributing and being a good data steward and citizen along the way. Joe, how do you get people to think in both modes about that, both about what they need for themselves, but also what they need for their organization as a whole?
This is a team effort, and oftentimes there may already be data governance programs, as I mentioned earlier, within organizations, but sometimes the digital analytics and marketing teams are disconnected from it, and like I just said, this needs to be a team effort. There's an opportunity to understand what's going on and how to integrate with those existing processes that may already be in place. And you have to be aware of what's happening globally within your organization, and then to use that to act locally. It's really, again, I mentioned this earlier in the webinar, that this is about breaking down silos. And that I just can't say how critical that is to have success with this.
Great. Yeah, totally a great point. So I think every webinar nowadays has to say something like create a single view of the customer. So we just had to throw a slide in here. But no, I wanted to put this in here to talk about kind of two aspects of data in my mind. There's event level data, which we talked a little bit about. I showed a few screenshots from our own product that talks about data quality at the event level. And by that, I mean a click, a page view, a swipe on a mobile app, making sure that the data that we want to collect with those events are accurate. But then there's another side of this, which is about using events as the building blocks to understand a person. I think the single view of the customer is such a holy grail that we hold up there as marketers and as businesses all the time to talk about understanding people across all the different channels, all the different teams, really, even that the data flows through. But Joe, I'm curious your thoughts on the topic of data quality at the individual element of an event, but also, there's data quality issues that happen outside of data collection when it comes to stitching together all of these little events to understand who a person is. We don't always think about that, or at least I don't always think about that when it comes to data quality. What are your thoughts there?
You're right, Adam. So, the data quality is not just about the accuracy of page views, product revenue, and other data from your typical digital analytics tools. It touches on all data assets of an organization. And this does include the view of an individual customer. And so when you're working with a customer data platform, it's common that you have multiple data sources all flowing into one system, hopefully. And so when that happens, what happens is that there can be conflicting definitions or duplication of data. So the quality of that data is so critical. It can be embarrassing to incorrectly market and use that data that is inaccurate. So I don't have an example ready, but I mean, we can all think of situations where you could incorrectly market to an individual customer because the data join was off or the data is just inaccurate with that. I mean, it even comes back to things like remarketing. After I purchase a product, am I remarketing back to that user to say, hey, you should buy these red shoes, even though I just bought them 10 minutes ago, right? It's about having a single view of the customer and using that data correctly and accurately.
And that's also a good way to get buy-in from people in the organization. You can always use that example of, hey, why are we doing this thing that we're doing, or why are we showing this ad to someone that we know in another tool should not be eligible for this ad? That's always a good way to get more buy-in across the org, because that's something that a lot of people care about, and marketing certainly doesn't want to spend money on that if they can move that spend over to something that can help move the needle for the right audience. On our next topic here, Joe, monitoring for data quality issues. I showed an example a little bit earlier on of building an event specification, defining what data goes into it, and then holding your data accountable to make sure that the implementation matches the data that's actually collected, and flagging for issues. This is really one of the topics that should be solved by tech in a lot of ways. But Joe is an analyst that spends a lot of time. I don't probably want to know how much time of your life you spend inside of Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, but curious your thoughts on as an analyst, how do I monitor for data quality issues, and how do you approach this with brands that want to think about how do they kind of keep tabs on how data is flowing through the systems?
Sure. So I want to share 3 tips to help brands monitor their data quality. So the first tip is set up alerts against your KPIs in your analytics tools. So tools like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, they have this underutilized feature called alerts. They might name them differently between tools, but essentially this is a feature that's already baked into the product. And by configuring this functionality, you can either set up a threshold or in some cases use anomaly detection that looks back at the historical data patterns to alert you and make your alerts intelligent, and to alert you if something is off. So if you're not logging in often into your analytics tools and checking your KPIs, how are you going to know that you have an issue until much later on? One of the ways to combat that is to leverage the alerts functionality. The second tip I have is to help prevent an issue is to use automated testing tools. So you can do this through what Adam was speaking about earlier. There's other tools like Observe Point, lots of these, several of these tools on the market, and you're able to set up automated tests against your critical user journeys, and then be alerted as soon as there is an issue. Oftentimes, you'll know about an issue before it even hits production if it's set up correctly. So we can all agree that our analytics implementations are complex. There's too much to test manually, and unless you have a tool that performs continuous QA, you don't have complete coverage. Things break, so act smarter with the right technology. Finally, my third tip is that you have to assign responsibilities. So I mentioned earlier the RACI matrix. So if there's no one that's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, then how do you expect to correct the issue in a timely manner and prevent them from happening in the future? That delegation, that responsibility is a really important piece about data quality and monitoring it and taking action.
So we've all spent about 45 minutes or so talking through a lot of different triggers, reasons why data quality issues pop up, how I might approach them, but now I need to create a plan. So Joe, what should I be thinking about today after I get off of this webinar to make this something actionable inside of my organization?
So remember that the data quality is a subset of data governance. And as I said earlier, data governance sounds like a scary word, but it's not. It's about taking a establishing the processes, getting the buy-in, pulling it all together. So really the plan of action is what we've been talking about today. There's a blog post that Ryan Chase on my team wrote just recently, and we'll link to this in the resource section here, but it's about how to bring data governance to digital analytics. And the blog post provides actionable steps to help you build and execute a data governance program within your organization. So we talk about the importance of a steering committee to oversee the usage and accuracy of data, the roles that need to be defined on the team, the goals that the organization aligns towards, the processes, the communication, the methods to increase adoption. And to be clear, this all doesn't happen overnight, but with the right commitment, executive sponsorship, you too can have better control and insight from your data.
Yeah, I love that. I think if we look back at what we've talked about, bringing these things together, and the common thread throughout really all of these is you can't do this alone. You can do some of it on your own, but you have to get organizational buy-in. That usually starts at the top, or can help if you start at the top. You need to build your view and your plan. I love some of the points around building a RACI matrix to match that buy-in that you've just gotten from the organization, who's responsible for what. Connect what you're doing to the larger privacy and compliance and legal risks that exist when you don't enforce good quality data governance inside of your organization. I get it that we don't always want to come from a place of fear, but sometimes it helps, and it certainly is important right now, where I think data and the increased amount of data that is being collected and leveraged as more and more experiences go digital, we've got to think about connecting these two dots because that will ultimately improve brand trust, and it will make all of us happier, both on the consumer side as well as inside of our organizations. We need to think about both angles, depending on where we sit inside of the organization. If I'm at a particular channel level or focusing on one particular part of data, I need to think about how do I improve the data quality here, but also how does this contribute to the wider global data collection throughout my organization, because both of those are important. And if I'm more on the kind of full oversight of the data flow across the organization, I need to have empathy and understand how this works for an individual as well, so that I can get their buy-in. One of the things I love that my CEO says is people buy into what they help create. So get people at all levels to be a part of creating these data quality standards inside the org. And it's not just about event level data, it's also about the higher level audience data and visitor data that's created. So I need to think about data quality, not just at the point of collection, but also throughout the entire journey of that data. And therefore I've got to monitor, and I've got to put my plan into action to make this happen. We're wrapping up towards the end of our webinar, but I think now is a good time for us to take some of the questions that have started to pop in into the chat window here. For those of you that may have questions, feel free to go ahead and chime in on some of those. We've got a couple during the webinar right now that Joe and I will tackle right now. So Megan, do you want to read some of the questions that we've gotten in so far?
Yep, perfect. And just a reminder to everyone that we will be sharing a link to the slides as well as the recording, so don't worry about that. We'll be sending that out after the webinar. Okay, so it looks like the first question, Joe, is for you. What specific steps to ensure GDPR compliance do I need to take with my data?
Sure. So on the topic of GDPR, and one thing I want to stress with this is that, GDPR is here to stay, and that your focus on privacy should never stop. It may appear that maybe enforcement of GDPR is sort of lacking right out of the gate, but use as an opportunity to get into compliance. It's interesting that in helping many clients with GDPR, I found that data quality always came into focus when talking about GDPR. And GDPR is in any data privacy regulation that exists today or into the future. It ultimately comes about one of the things that's important with data quality is understanding, well, why are you collecting the data and what are you using that data for? How long are you storing the data? These are some of the pieces that you really have to have in context as you approach GDPR.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us sometimes think of GDPR as something that's just European, but even if you think that you just focus on U.S. only consumers and you don't have anything to do with Europe whatsoever, one, I would push back on that, but two, I would point to the number of other states, including right here in California, where this might be a ballot initiative coming up, or it might be on the an upcoming election, to have some of the same points that are in GDPR, something that is law here in the U.S. So this is certainly something that even if you don't think one particular set of regulations applies to you, it certainly does across the board. And I think from my standpoint, hopefully everyone's fully compliant and in a great place. But if you have questions about it, you've got to start with the fundamentals of understanding what data you're collecting, mapping out what we call data flows. How does that data flow throughout your organization? And then doing exercises to then take some of the aspects of GDPR, such as what do I do when someone requests their information? How do I delete information? If you don't know what data you have and where it goes, it makes it impossible to then look at how do I fulfill some of those rights of a data subject. So I think working backwards, but understanding where data goes is one of the important first steps to take.
Great, thank you. Joe, here's another good one for you. Can you speak to your thoughts around data owner versus the A, accountable, and R, responsible part of the RACI? In my view, data owner is the equivalent of the A, accountable.
Great question. So, yeah, in that RACI matrix, the way I look at it is that the accountable person is the person that's ultimately, that has to answer to this activity. And the responsible person is the one that actually completes the task. So with that being said, the data owner, I would agree, would be the accountable assignment on that RACI.
Okay, great. All right, it looks like we have time for one more question. Adam, I think this was a good one for you. How does stitching data together work when I have multiple technologies that don't share the same data or work together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty common challenge because there's very little technology that was purpose-built to work together. I think there was a study that came out recently that looked at enterprises that used 90 plus different marketing cloud applications to run their business. So when you think about all the different tech that's used that creates data or needs data to do stuff, you kind of have to abstract out away from thinking just about the tools that you have and what data that they need, and think about the organization's data and goals. And that's where I like, I mentioned earlier on the idea of building a data layer. That's something that a lot of people do. That's something that's vendor neutral. I'm defining the data that's defined for my business, the way that we refer to it. I have an inventory, hey, that's another thing that's helpful for GDPR, but I have an inventory or a dictionary of the data that I collect. I can start there and then map that to the vendors that I need to get that data to. It sounds like a no-brainer, like that's what everybody does, but oftentimes just shifting that view away from being vendor specific to being more specific to your organization, the data that's important, can help you start to then see where the connection can then happen with how data should map to one another. You also do need to think about having a middleware approach or an approach to data that feeds to multiple systems and doesn't necessarily rely on a game of telephone where one vendor tells another, that vendor tells another. I think that's almost inherently going to create issues. So you need to think about, how do I build a foundation of data that is specific to my business, tag management was a great start for this for most organizations. But as you think about one of the most important things, which is stitching together a person and updating all of the systems with that person level data, again, that's something that needs to happen at a neutral level. You can't take that from your email vendor and send it over to your analytics vendor. You need to have a platform that's specifically designed for customer data, and make sure that you're feeding that data from that neutral application layer into, or that neutral data layer rather, into the execution layer of where you're going to take action on that. So it's really around kind of separating that out. It's something that Telium is obviously very passionate about in helping companies kind of focus on taking control of their own data. So I think that's a great question. So one other point before we wrap up today. There are a number of resources that are available here on the right-hand side of your screen. We have a couple papers for you to dive in more on data governance. We also have some data on how Telium and Blast Analytics and Marketing work together to stitch together universal views, helping to map out the customer journey to fuel better data-driven decisions inside of your organization. So I encourage you, some of the blog posts that Joe referenced as well are also linked up. We thank you so much for your time today. This was a really great hour. We covered quite a bit. You can visit our websites, telium.com and blastam.com. And to Joe, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thanks for having me, Adam. This was a lot of fun. And thank you for everyone's time.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.